Good evening. I'm Pittsburgh City Councilman Daniel Lavelle,
And I'm Councilman Reverend Ricky Burgess.
and we welcome you again to Black Pittsburgh Matters. Black Pittsburgh Matters is a series of virtual town hall meetings affirming a citywide agenda that Black Pittsburgh indeed matters. Black Pittsburgh Matters means that Black lives matter, protecting the health and safety of Black people matters, that Black communities matter. It means we must rebuild our communities and invest in them. And it means that Black wealth matters. We must increase Black employment entrepreneurship opportunities.
The Black community has been disproportionately affected by concurrent crises. The COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis, and race relations, which is a public health crisis. Normally, in times of crisis and great change like this, we'd be coming to you as the Black elected officials of Pittsburgh and having town hall meetings across our city with our constituents, partners, and allies. Since we cannot do this safely in the current pandemic, we're now using this media and platform to come to you in the ways we can, to talk about what we're doing and discuss policy and legislation concerning Black Pittsburgh. These meetings will be available via Facebook, YouTube, and the city's cable channel. You can contact or ask their questions via the Black Pittsburgh Matters Facebook page or email us at blackpghmatters@gmail.com. And you can do that even right now. Today's town hall meeting topic is sustainability and resiliency in the wake of COVID-19. Across our country, Black people are more likely to contract and die from COVID-19 than their white counterparts. In Allegheny County, Black residents comprise 13% of the population, but have accounted for 25% of COVID-19 cases and 19% of all deaths, according to the Allegheny County Health Department. In addition, Black businesses have also been devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The National Bureau of Economic Research found that during the pandemic, over 41% of Black businesses have failed. As historic numbers of Black-owned businesses shuttered, the Center for Responsible Lending estimated that up to 95% of Black businesses remain ineligible to receive the Federal CARES Act Paycheck Protection Plan funding. So what we have even here in Pittsburgh is a great strain on the Black business community.
And unfortunately, Rev, as we have seen across our country and here in Pittsburgh, because of COVID-19, Black people are disproportionately getting sick and dying, and Black businesses are being devastated. The COVID-19 pandemic is simply the latest reminder of our country and our city's moral imperative to begin distributing resources based upon racial equity, which means a disproportionate investment in Black people and the communities in which they live. The World Health Organization's social determinants of health remind us that we must significantly invest in economic development, education, housing, employment and entrepreneurship, and we must continue to do this until Black communities have sufficient community amenities and resident opportunities for a high quality of life for Black people.
Yeah, and this week, Vice President Biden came and began to talk about, the need for better race relations. And today, you and I sent the Vice President, as you know, a letter asking him to come back to Pittsburgh to tour Black communities, to say that Black Pittsburgh matters, and to commit to rebuilding Black urban areas where the majority in our cities, Black people live, play, and worship. And hopefully he'll come back and we can showcase the need for greater investment in our communities.
In addition to that, I think it's important for people to understand, because early on you spoke about legislation and this being a platform to highlight it, that at the end of July, we passed legislation creating a commission on racial equity. And that commission is going to be charged with leading this effort to rebuild our communities. But that commission is also looking at the World Health Organization's social determinants of health. And that commission is actually based upon those principles. And the subcommittees that will actually be engaged will be engaged based upon those actual principles. And so we have, to the greatest extent possible, intently aligned our efforts with those best national practices so that we can rebuild this community.
Yeah, and on that note, we are honored to have 5 experts on the issue of sustainability and resiliency in the Black community to join us for our discussion today. We have Mr. Fred Brown, President and CEO of the Forest Fund, Dr. Joylette Portlock, Executive Director of Sustainable Pittsburgh, and Mr. Mark Lewis, President and CEO of the Poise Foundation. Good evening and welcome to our town hall.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thanks very much to the both of you for having us.
Thank you all for joining us. So I actually want to start with Mr. Fred Brown. And I want to start there because twice we've mentioned the World Health Organization's social determinants of health. And you were the first person who ever educated me and informed me to what those are and the importance of them. And so I had to learn what that was about and the significance it has to rebuilding our community. And so for those who are watching, I don't want them to be as ignorant as I once was. Would you please help educate us on what those are and the importance of them as we attempt to rebuild our communities?
Well, thank you. I think the importance of the social determinants of health, when you look at education, income stability, affordable housing, community context, and health and healthcare, those 5 elements really create what we call a holistic delivery system that wraps around the human being. What we've done for many years in the city and across the country is we've attempted to resolve social phenomena from a single point of contact. We throw money at education, we throw money at housing, we throw money at health and well-being, when in reality, a person is being impacted by multiple things every day. In many ways, we have to reconstruct the way we think about problem solving. And the World Health Order has really helped us create a framework to consider how we did that on a global level. And so if you ask me what I think is critical, I think the social determinants of health is a local application for us to really galvanize the sector. And then, as you know, last year, the city of Pittsburgh became the second U.S. city to adopt the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which you alluded to. And so when you look at those 2 frameworks, it creates a local to global application of our work in the city of Pittsburgh. And you guys are laying the foundation for us to create a solid application for how we do our work moving forward, given the 4 critical issues happening over the next 40 years. Income inequality, 2030 climate change, 2040 minority population becoming the majority, in 2050, 70% of the world's population moving into the urban corridor. And so all of the people on today's call, to me, play an integral role in helping us think through what needs to be built around the human family to create a humanitarian response as a sector, as opposed to individual responses through those social determinant of health frameworks.
So on that, Dr. Portlock, COVID-19 is a respiratory virus, which means air quality and environment are even more important factors in Black health outcomes during this current pandemic. Because environmental health has such a big impact on physical health right now, and because I know that you're a member of the County Board of Health, as I was at one point, can you speak a little bit about environmental racism and what environmental justice in Pittsburgh may look like?
Sure. So environmental racism is the concept of environmental hazards disproportionately affecting communities of color based on race. And I think, what's been clear for some time, decades, it's been reported, the number of different kinds of health disparities that exist between the white population and Black population in Pittsburgh. This is not new news, but the disparities are serious and they do persist. I think what's important, and just to touch on Fred's earlier point, and this concept of frameworks and how we look at these issues, is to really recognize that these things are not, they're not separate issues. So when you talk about a cardiovascular outcome or a respiratory ailment, there's an environmental context that is informing that, right? That's part of the same conversation, and that we should be approaching it from that way. So environmental health definitely affects health, and there are disproportionate impacts in the quality of the environment. the other thing that I want to just make clear for everyone watching, right, is that environment is not some faraway other place, right? It's not a glacier somewhere, you know, or a forest, a pristine forest, right? Environment is where we all live. Environment is where we live. It's where we work. It's your home. And there are so many factors that go into why environmental hazards are disproportionately impacting negatively the health of the Black population here. And that's everything from housing to industrial pollution. There's so many numbers of things. And we do know from reports that that's contributing as well to the negative health outcomes that are being now exacerbated by COVID.
So, one, I'll admit that environmental justice is something that I've really just come to better understand within the last year or so. It wasn't something that I was fully educated on. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how do we move forward. So I'll give you one example. A colleague of ours, DeWitt Walton, we were having this conversation, and he was talking to me about the way the city demolishes homes and how we demolish very old homes. We put them in the ground, and that lead is now in the ground. That when we dig up that home to rebuild, we're digging all of that back up. And that's just simply one example of how we're sort of contributing to this problem. And so now they're looking at better ways to dismantle homes so that you're not spreading the lead. But can you give sort of examples of what we can actively be doing to address environmental justice?
That's a great question, you know, and part of the challenge with addressing any of these issues, right, is that they are interrelated, right? You talk about the impacts of having lower quality housing stock in an environmental degradation situation where you've got increased water infiltration that causes more mold in your indoor air quality that exacerbates the asthma disparities that we see along racial lines. What's the solution for that? Well, the solution is improving the housing stock. The solution's also, you know, creating opportunities for wealth for those in the community to have options of what the housing looks like, right? So these, I think, if there's one take home, it's going to be what Fred already said. I think for me for this conversation, sustainability really is about at some level being comfortable with the complexity of these conversations and making sure that you have the right inputs into creating a solution that actually works along a lot of different axes.
Mr. Lewis, Mark, you have been a mentor of mine to explain about Black wealth and the need to be very thoughtful of how we build in the Black community and Black people Black wealth. What are you seeing? What's been the financial impact of COVID in Pittsburgh on the Black community? What do you think in terms of the financial impact? What are the greatest needs? What do you see right now? What's going on?
Sure, that's a great question. So unfortunately, I can't give you up-to-date statistics because a lot of that information is usually months behind, or not even years behind what actually takes place. But if you take it or think about it from the context of where we were before COVID-19, right? And so in Pittsburgh, we've always had these, and like many communities, great disparities in wealth, great disparities in income. You know, when it comes to home ownership, when it comes to health, when it comes to everything that's been talked about before from sustainability and looking at this from a very complex issue, the Black community has always been at the low end of these disparities. And, you know, maybe it's another conversation, but that's not by accident. So when COVID hits, or something like COVID hits, what that does is covers back probably all the way. They were already halfway back, right, on all of our issues, but it brings the covers all the way back. So if you think about it from the perspective of owning a home, you know, most people say, or a lot of people think that, okay, I rent today, I want to just go into home ownership. When you own a home, you have to be prepared for what home ownership means. And that includes the maintenance, that includes all the issues that take place. and you've got to have something prepared to deal with all that. It's not just about your mortgage. And so from a financial perspective, I think the Black community here in Pittsburgh, or a large part of us, are in that same perspective, right? If you're low income, if you're barely making ends meet, then you're always in that same situation of not, or at least the perception of not being able to have enough to put something aside for when these type of events take place. And so the devastation on our community has been great for a couple reasons. One, Black people make up a disproportionate share of the essential jobs that take place in our community. So what that did for many of us was put us at a higher risk of being in the virus's path, right? And so the essential workers were the ones who could not stay home. They had to be out there, and they were put at risk. And so from a health perspective, when you are put at risk, or if you contract a disease or the virus, then you're not working, it has a major impact on your household. On the flip side, Black people are also highly disproportionately represented in non-essential workers, in low-income non-essential workers. So we were the first ones let go, or we were the first jobs that could not work at home. And so we were impacted in a huge way by both of those aspects from a financial perspective. And so therefore, if you don't have savings, if you don't have some type of reserve, then what do you do when these type of events take place? And so we saw our community at a much greater need, whether it was food, whether it was on the medical side of needing assistance, to be provided by many of the nonprofits that provide various social services in our community. The problem with that was that when this virus hit, our social service sector was impacted as well. And so now the people that we rely on to provide those financial supports, or those simple daily basic needs supports, that disappeared as well. And so what we see today is, how do we recover? Someone mentioned businesses earlier today. The same thing exists with many of our households, exists with a lot of our businesses. Most of our businesses are operating at a level that is either barely sustainable, or just do not have access to the capital that they need to really make their businesses viable, and really being able to, like a family, put reserves away for these types of events that take place. So we saw it on the personal side, we saw it on the business side. Our community, unfortunately, and there are, again, many reasons for that, we just don't have the financial reserves to deal with issues that take place like in COVID-19.
So Mark, you mentioned access to capital. And this was sort of an interesting conversation for me I've had within the last week. Within the past week, I had a family member who passed away and was buried, and he worked in the banking industry. And what the request was, in lieu of flowers and everything else, to actually make donations to the Poise Foundation. And because much of what he believed in was access to capital. And I think it's timely, because I know, I believe anyway, that August was Black Philanthropically Month, I believe.
Yep.
So I'm just curious to think through, how can we or government better partner with the philanthropic community, specifically the Poise Foundation, in order to provide more access to capital so we can indeed build up our business community within the city?
Sure, no, that's a great question. And my condolences to your uncle. He was a great friend. I was actually shocked when I saw that in the paper that he had passed away. So when we talk about wealth in this country, and unfortunately over the last couple of decades, we've seen wealth be shifted from the middle class up to a very few individuals that control really most of the wealth in the world. Access to capital, whether you're an individual family looking to buy a home, or looking to invest in whatever, looking to invest in business, looking to invest in education, is critical. Access to capital in the business, that's the way this country works. And capital is how we invest, we reinvest. It's how we create foundations for hope, if you want to think about that basically. My hope is that if I start a business and it's a good idea, that I can go to a financial institution and they will seed, right, my dream. That's what this country talks about. Unfortunately, what we see so often is that, dreams for certain parts of our community, our society, are seeded, where similar dreams for others just aren't. And so that's not always an issue of, do we have the right business plan? Do we have the right idea? That's just a simple issue of bias. You know, if we want to call it out, you know, structural racism and everything else that leads to that. In this country, we need to get to a place where Black people and Black businesses own. Pure and simple. I don't care if it's owning a house, owning a business, owning a few shares of stock, cooperatives, whatever that is, we need to get to a place where we own. And, you know, this country is built, it's a capitalistic country. There's good things about it, there's bad things about it. Whether you believe in capitalism, whether you don't, that's the situation, that's the system that we're under. And so if you are not owning something, then you don't control it, right? So we always talk about our neighborhoods. When we look at most of our Black neighborhoods, a lot of them are extremely high, you know, rental or, you know, renters make up a high percentage of our neighborhoods. We don't own the neighborhood. So when we talk about controlling what happens in the neighborhood, we don't have that control. So whether it's Poise Foundation, we lost Dwelling House Savings Bank, which your grandfather started, and father were integral in, we're losing financial institutions in our community that are critical for ownership. And so when you think about a Poise Foundation, right now, we're a small Black community foundation. We're one of 3 that I know of in the country. And we only have $9 million in assets. And we've been around for 40 years, right? And only have $9 million of assets. Poise Foundation should be at about $100 million in assets, even if all that just came from our community, which our community can do, right? I'll get into that a little bit later. But if you think about that, at $100 million, foundations typically give away $5 million in, you know, 5% of their assets in grant making every year. But what we fail to talk about is that other 95%. So foundations, the way foundations work, we get contributions coming in, people start funds, we pull those resources together and we invest those resources into stocks, to bonds, to various projects in order to make a return, right? There is no reason that if Poise Foundation was a $100 million organization, that we would not take a part of those funds and invest them back into small Black-owned businesses within our community. That's the importance of why we need to build a Poise Foundation, why we need to figure out how to create another Black bank. Because when we collectively pool our assets together, that becomes the foundation for investing in the dreams that our community should have and often doesn't, because when they you know, have a dream, you look around, you say, okay, so how do I fund this dream? And too often we don't have the access to capital to be able to fund our dreams.
Fred, Fred has been and has actually changed my thinking. Fred's been a great friend and great teacher. He's the first person I've ever heard talk about eco districts, right? And I've been thinking a lot about that because of COVID-19, right? Because if we're going to rebuild these Black communities, we have to right size them. Many of our Black communities, as you know, are vacant. And Larmer, you were instrumental in making Larmer Pittsburgh's first Black eco district. And so I want you to sort of explain what eco districts are and then why they are important in terms of the redevelopment of Black communities.
Thank you. I want to thank the members who are on this call and others who may not be, that have been part of the Eco Districts framework. Last November, we hosted the 10th annual Eco Districts Conference in the city of Pittsburgh. And by all accounts, it was the most diverse Eco Districts Conference held in 10 years. That's a strong testament to the city of Pittsburgh being able to pull together regional, national, and global people to come to Pittsburgh to participate in that. I think that's no accident. I think Pittsburgh is a global destination. When I was in Greece, I was walking on the beach with my wife and stopped for dinner, ran into some people, and they started talking to me about where they were from. We said we were from Pittsburgh. And the whole rest of the trip, people wanted to talk to me about getting to Pittsburgh, from Australia, from the UK. And I was dumbfounded by this. Our global representation as a global center is global, literally. The devastating thing is when you come back home and you talk to Black and brown people about this realization, we have no clue. So eco districts allowed us to have a global platform that was driven by people of color. So the work executed in Larmer in 2009 with the execution in 2010 of the land use study and market study driven by people of color with the support of you, Reverend Burgess, as well, resulted in a landmark award of $30 million to that community based upon the Eco District framework. So we're looking at water use, land use, energy consumption, how we use parks and recreation, how we use the built environment and look at the typography of a particular place and optimize that in the city. And so one of the things Pittsburgh has, at least in the East End, is we have between Homewood and Larmer, there's over 5,000 vacant lands and lots, and it constitutes the 2 poorest census tracts in the city of Pittsburgh with the largest contiguous flat land mass. What that means is a developer can come there, look at flat land masses, and build with little to no impact on the rest of the community with regards to having to do scatter sites, right? But when you rethink about that and you think about what happened in Larmer, we talked about green space, right? And this is when we start talking about, Rev, you said something that was very critical. You know, I always ask developers and city planners, what is the ecological footprint for an idea? And nobody ever answers me. And so let me just stop and say, in Larmer, during this heyday, it had 17,340 some people in it. Today is what, 1,700. Homewood had 30,000 people in it. Today it's like 6,442 people. So when we talk about ecological footprint, we're talking about the population density in a geographical location. Let me get, this is incredibly important. When we were in New York, we went to Harlem. And Harlem's 1 square mile, they have 217,000 people in 1 square mile. Homewood's 1 square mile, they got 6,442 people. And so when you start talking about rebuilding a community, you can build a community's density based upon the projected number of people you want to have in it. And then what you do is once you make that projection, and I'm using the Eco Districts framework, you begin to look at how much park edge development do you want to have to produce market rate housing? How much infill housing do you want to have to look at affordability? How much mixed income housing do you want to have to stratify the community? And that's a strategy. And one of the things that we were able to support through the work in Larmer was this third and a third and a third mix to really create a mixed income construct that represented the whole ecosystem or arc of the region. Eco districts is really about this notion of looking at the built environment and optimizing those assets. And so in Pittsburgh, one of the assets we have is an abundance of water. And so one of the greatest areas that we want to capture Eco Districts construct is how do we capture more stormwater and eliminate it from running into wells and into the river. And so, you know, Rev, on the Larmer project, it's one of the first ones we did in the city where we had separated stormwater from rainwater, even before the city was ready to do that. And so those kind of forward-thinking processes allows us to do bioswale cisterns, capture 100% of stormwater on site. And these are the kind of things the city, in my opinion, should adopt, because as you look around the city right now, whenever we have a rain event, it's almost a 50 or 100-year event. We see flooding in places we haven't seen flooding before. We see people's housing taking in water in ways they haven't before. And so if we keep building the same way, we're going to increase the amount of stormwater that goes into the sector, which produces more flooding. And so Eco Districts is this natural, organic way to really look at what does each community offer as a way of an asset, and then how do you build on that in an ecological way that preserves energy, looks at alternative energy sources, captures stormwater, and one of the most important things it does to me is it offers a way for regular people who may not be attuned to this to understand the value of energy reduction, the value of stormwater management, gray water reuse, things we take for granted, which becomes a class in science and how you live. And we have to be, I think, Daniel, you might have said this before, we have to teach our community how to deal with complexity. Or I think you might have said it, Dr. Portlock. And we don't. We kind of give people the most least common denominator answer as opposed to dealing with the geometrical equation. Like, we got real problems. They ain't gonna get resolved by giving you the easiest answer. 2 + 2 is 4. It's much more complicated than that, but it's not impossible. And I think eco districts offers us a lens to really look at the built environment as a way to really address that on multiple levels.
I think if I can just quickly touch base on that, I'm sorry. Is that all right?
Yes, I was going to ask you. I was going to come to you. I was going to ask. This is your area of expertise. I wanted to know your view of eco districts and just how important the environment is to resiliency, but particularly for the Black community.
Right. Well, and to build on what Fred said, you know, what you're really talking about with an eco district with sustainable development is building resiliency in the community. I mean, you talk about some of the very real threats that are disproportionately felt from the environmental side. I've been in a lot of conversations lately talking about climate change and climate impacts, right? And a concept of a sustainable community is one that is resilient to all kinds of threats. And, you know, it's true globally, it's true locally and globally that the communities with the least, which is generally our Black communities, are going to be hurt the worst by some of those impacts because they have the fewest resources to deal with it. So you're talking about building a more resilient community, but also I think what's key about the eco districts concept and sustainable development in general is that you're building a community where people want to live. Right? If you're talking about how do you rebuild a community, something I heard, so I heard Majora Carter speak several months ago, and some of what she said just really stuck with me. You know, we want to not conflate poverty with culture. That was what she said. That, you know, it is important for people to have affordable housing. It is also important for communities to be generative, right? In the kinds of things Mark was talking about in terms of being able to sustain the population, provide jobs, provide amenities, and those kinds of things. And I think a framework like eco districts helps to accomplish some of those goals at the same time as building resilience to the threats from impacts. I should also mention that, so as part of the ongoing work in this area of sustainable community development, Sustainable Pittsburgh, along with Forbes Funds, New Sun Rising, Green Building Alliance, and other partners are working on a collaborative effort called District PGH. So if there are community leaders out there, many of whom have already engaged and want to engage further in understanding more, learning more, and thinking about what local resources exist to help communities develop, I had to do that plug. I did want to also express my condolences to Councilman Lavelle for your recent loss. That's, you know, these are just such challenging times. And I think that, you know, one of the things that's been coming up for me over and over again as I've been listening to Fred and to Mark talk is that, and this whole conversation really is something I just learned kind of recently, which is that the saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, was originally about an impossible task. Right? That was the saying was originally to describe something impossible. There absolutely need to be interventions and kind of an interrogation of all the different systems that are causing these disparities that exist. I mean, Sustainable Pittsburgh is an organization that, you know, works in many communities across the 10-county region, not only in Black communities, but our mission is to empower decision-making that creates a more equitable, resilient, healthy, and prosperous region, all of which are extremely important and nowhere more so than in our Black communities.
So some of what I'm hearing, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that there needs to be sort of specific place-based interventions that exist within our communities, whether it's the eco district, whether it's the development of business districts using Black philanthropy at its core, I'm just, and this is for anyone in particular, I'm just curious to hear about some place-based strategies you would recommend we employ to address our community as we come up out of this COVID crisis.
I can start, but I'm sure others will have additional comments. I mean, I think one of the things that we've been grappling with at Sustainable Pittsburgh, we work with a number of different organizations, hundreds of organizations across the region, and there's just such a critical and urgent present need, and huge disparities in even that need, which is so critical. So there's immediate needs to be met in terms of financial stability, in terms of basic services, in terms of really just immediate sustaining, right? But then there's these longer term strategies around, as Fred was saying, the built environment, and as Mark was saying, around education, and especially around financial literacy, right? These are the tools that will help build from now into the future.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Let's make sure when we talk about place-based strategies that we're not just talking about the place. The critical piece of that is the people, right? And so although we may be investing in a neighborhood, it's critical that we're investing in those people. That's the whole issue of gentrification. Gentrification happens because we invest in the physical structures, but we don't invest in the individuals. And so when the physical structures become attractive, right, the individuals that were there don't have the financial wherewithal to take advantage of what's now become attractive. And so they get pushed out. And so, for example, I think affordable housing, although it's necessary, should never be a long-term strategy, right? Because all affordable housing does is it band-aids, if that's, maybe that's a bad use of a word, but it band-aids the fact that poverty or some level of poverty exists, right? What we should be thinking about is how do we use affordable housing as a platform to help somebody get to the place where they can afford the housing that they want. And so as we're thinking about place-based, which I think, you have to revitalize neighborhoods, you have to invest in the physical structures, but if we're not investing in those individuals that live in that place today, then it will be a place-based strategy for somebody else.
And that's where the complexity comes in, because this has to be a comprehensive conversation.
Right. Well, that's why I've always loved eco districts, because in 2009, when I got turned on to transition towns first out of the UK, and Sophie and the rest came in from the UK and trained me in eco districts, and Rob Hopkins, the co-founder, gave me permission after, I think in 2010, I went to Chicago and got certified in Thrive, which was their model. Then I got introduced to eco districts by Christine Maunder, who I think is one of the premier thinkers in this work, and I call her one of the mothers of eco districts. And so over the past 10 years, she and I have been presenting around the country around how do we get architects and engineers to build buildings that, to Mark's point, educates people how to optimize the footprint of the building, right? What we do now is we build buildings already optimized, and if you're not cognizant of how to optimize it, you destroy it. So even some of the buildings we're even supporting now that are sustainable in nature, even in the affordable construct, developers are having problems with people breaking the envelope on those units and allowing moisture to seep in, which is causing mold. So they're having to spend money to remediate mold in a unit that was built to be efficient. And so to Mark's point, you can build all the things you want if you don't build that in conjunction with people so that they understand the value of that, then you're gonna have a hit or miss situation. And given what we have is what we've seen over the last 80 months in the city of Pittsburgh, 3 epicenters, downtown, Lawrenceville, and East Liberty. In some cases, in the last 80 months, property values have increased as much as 217%. To Mark's point, who could stay in that community at that point, right? And so when we think about what Joy said, which is the complexity is what is the bridge between what Mark alluded to, how do we use affordable housing as a platform and move people into their own sense of what they want that's not affordable, but within their construct of what's healthy, we don't think like that. We just build and then say, who can afford to live here? And it just pushes people around. And then we go, well, what are we going to do with all these people over here that's hanging around, getting pushed out? We should be thinking about them before we start building. They should be included in the process. And why I like eco districts is because if you really deconstruct it, it's a math class, it's a science class, it's an econ class, it's a human-centered design class. It's a whole university in and of itself. And at each level, you can actually train somebody in a career pathway that represents the 21st century global economy. But instead, we take the most least restrictive aspect of it and just do the building part. And so I think if you really took eco districts and you pulled back from it and said, what are the cross-functional elements of it that will work in high school, that will work in grade school, it would be phenomenal, Rev. And Daniel, if we looked at these communities that have the opportunity to be rebirthed, if we reimagine each of those communities as a college experience through the built environment, and we reverse engineered what they need in elementary school, what they need in middle school, what they need in high school, what internships they need, so that we build a community of people who live in the units that become central for how we optimize living collectively and minimizing our impact on our environment. And we don't do that. And to Joy's point, we build things that are inviting the people. When I was in Portland, their eco districts framework is inviting people from all around the world. They got a waiting list for people to live there. But the flip side of that is the people who did live there got pushed out. And so we have to figure out how to mitigate that kind of change, because we already see the evidence that we're on the same pathway to be Portland if we don't stop and think differently about how we do our built environment framework.
I think, Fred, you agree that Larimer is a different model, and that's we've been, that's where we first start working together, and that in Larimer, we didn't think about buildings, but how do we transform the lives of the people? And then the buildings are simply part of a larger process to provide them with certainly clean, decent, affordable housing, but in addition to that, all the amenities and all of the neighborhood things they need in order to have a good life. And if you do it carefully, because you have to build affordable housing first, because you have to build for the people who are already there. You have to do it carefully, so it also brings other investment. As you know, and in Larimer right now, we have now market rate development going on alongside affordable housing. And so I think Larimer is the best example of what's possible. And I just, so I guess my question, Mark, and I really, I think about this all the time. Mark was the first person to talk to me about wealth and how in Allegheny County, wealth is actually, Black wealth is not in the city. Black wealth is in the suburbs. That's where the money, Black wealth is in the suburbs, but they come to the city to get their hair done, to get some wings or some ribs, maybe a drink, and then back to the suburbs. So Mark, what do we do? How do we harness the wealth that's in the suburbs and figure out a way to invest that wealth or have impact in the inner city?
Sure. So just to share some numbers, I think it was the 2010 census that for the first time in maybe 50 years, there were more Black people who lived outside the city of Pittsburgh than in the city of Pittsburgh. And as of 2018, I think those are the last numbers I had, Black income in the Pittsburgh region is about $4 billion. And out of that $4 billion, 1.2 billion comes from the city of Pittsburgh itself. So 3/4 of our income in the Black community lives outside of the city of Pittsburgh, right? And so when you think about what that means, I would love to be able to say that people in the suburbs all come back in the city to spend their money and support Black businesses, but that's not actually true. So when it comes to buying power, when it just comes to buying choices, a lot of us look at convenience, right, as a critical piece. So if I have a store that's 2 blocks from my house, 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna go patronize that store before I make a 5-mile, 6-mile trek into the city, right? And so what we as the Black community needs to really think about, and let me back that up. What we as Black people really need to think about in the Pittsburgh region is how do we operate as a community? Because I think we have neighborhoods, but I would be, I would challenge us to say that we have a Black community, because a community would be supporting itself, would be investing in itself. It would be doing all these things where the income that we generate, the disposable income that we have, we would take some portion of that and reinvest in us. Right now, based on just, basic numbers, statistical numbers, we spend as a Black community or Black people about 95 to 96% of our disposable income outside of the Black community. Think about that, $4 billion on an annual basis, we hand over to somebody outside of our community every year. So I've been talking for quite a while now, what would it look like if we just shifted 5% of our spend focused on Black businesses? Some of them we may have to create because they may not even exist yet. That's 5%. We could all in our household shift 5% and not have a major adjustment to our lifestyle, right? That's not a lot. But that 5% is $200 million a year that could support Black business, that would support Black jobs, that would change the trajectory of our community, that would create wealth, right? And as Joylette, mentioned earlier, we need some financial literacy attached to that so we can understand, how dollars actually move within our community. I did a seminar last year and I showed that if you take $100 in your pocket and you spent that within the Black community, that could change, or that could turn into $300 of economic impact in our community. Every $100 that we spend on our community could actually turn into $300. You could triple the impact we have. So we need to really think about, what does community look like? Some of that might be sacrifice, right? Instead of me being able to take 5 minutes and go to the store down the street, I may need to drive 5 miles to invest in a Black business. But if that investing in that Black business is going to help our community, it's going to help maybe my child or my grandchild get a job, or your child or grandchild get a job, then those are sacrifices we need to think about making. Because I think, again, Joylette and Fred both talked about, we need to be thinking about the long term, not just what looks good today, what looks good tomorrow, what looks good for us in 20 years, in 40 years, right? How do we leave an inheritance for our children's children's children? And so we need to start thinking, change our mindset to really start thinking about us as a community and how that impact can really change, what happens.
Privately, Mr. Lavelle and I have been working on something that the mayor referenced for the first time publicly yesterday. He and I have been working on this concept called Avenues of Hope, which is to strategically rebuild Black business districts in Black communities. And so we're looking, the mayor mentioned that, we're working to partner with him. We do think Homewood Avenue, Center Avenue may be the first, but imagine if, both Center Avenue and Homewood Avenue had Black businesses that were competitive in quality to any other business. And, both of them are close to places where there's resources. The Hill District's still close to downtown, Homewood's close to Point Breeze, and could attract a variety of diverse business owners. I think of all the things that we've been doing recently, I think this Avenue of Hope concept, I'm really excited by the potential of rebuilding Black businesses.
Can I make one point real quick? So if you think about this, and this is the point for governmental and probably corporate investment into making that happen. I think about this a lot, and Daniel, you may have better statistics on this than I do, but prior to the destruction of the Hill, when we decided to build an arena for Civic Light Opera and built this nice dome, that when the Civic Light Opera got into the dome, figured out the acoustics didn't work. So we destroyed a neighborhood, right, to build something that didn't work. Prior to destroying that neighborhood, I hear there were probably like 800 Black businesses that existed back then. And as a result, or at least we destroyed somewhere close to 800 Black businesses. On an average, if you look at all businesses, about a third of businesses succeed. About 2/3, maybe half fail. Can you imagine we're 60, 70 years from that event, that if 200 of those or 260 of those businesses would have succeeded, where some of those businesses could be today? Maybe one of those would be Heinz, right? Maybe one of those would be a PNC. Could you imagine where dwelling house savings would have been if those Black businesses were depositing their money? So my point is that we destroyed a future path that now none of us know what that looks like, because those businesses that could have existed today and could be employing tens of thousands of Black people don't exist, right? And that was done by our government, that was done by our corporate, community. And so to me, there is reason to invest in your idea of an avenue of hope from the government, from our corporate community.
I think that, there's a lot of important points made there. And I think that one of the ones that sticks out to me too is this long-term view, right? Is the importance of thinking about, there's a lot of focus right now on racial justice as a social conversation, but it's just so critically important that we look at what we can build now structurally. That's through policy, including corporate policy, right? That's in a lot of different systems, across a lot of different systems. What can we put into place now so that those possibilities remain there after this moment of intense focus on racial justice is maybe not the forefront of the national conversation, right? We haven't really talked about that a lot. It's one of the reasons I think conversations like this are so critical. Forums like this, efforts like this are critical, because we have to shape systems now to correct the systemic injustices that have existed. And I did want to thank Fred too for bringing up Christine Mondor. I should have mentioned Evolve-EA is also a partner in the district PGH work, which in many ways is parallel/building on the important pioneering work that was done with eco districts in Larimer.
I would just add to both of my colleagues' perspectives that I would offer a third perspective. One is, we have heavily invested in optimizing systems that are perpetuated on the built economy. And what we're talking about through an eco districts framework is optimizing human beings that can create any system that functions, which I call creating ecosystems, living and breathing things. If we think differently about taking a human-centered design approach and saying, what is the most valuable asset in Pittsburgh? It's the family. It would change the way we police, educate. It would change every facet of how we currently conduct business, because the most vital, precious element would be people. But instead, we go in a different direction, and we wonder why there's such discrepancy and disparity. You can't, when Mark talks about Wiley Street Days being destroyed, and you read Dr. Fullerlove's book, and you understand that lineage, and Daniel, once again, our condolences to your family, but your family's business as well, right? Had Wiley Street stayed intact, would the dwelling house have been a powerhouse, right? Most likely it would have been, right? How many jobs and new investment strategies would that have created? We'll never know. And so there is a onus on the city to repair that, right? They have an obligation to make that right, to level set that. And we can't piecemeal that. That whole community was destroyed. Not in pieces, the entire community was destroyed. Now, if we did that in Squirrel Hill, you got there going to bet you there would be a heck of a response. If we did it, we would have had to build a whole new Squirrel Hill somewhere.
I think you're touching on a really important point, something that I've been thinking about during this conversation as well, which is also the representation piece, right? Having community voices as part of the decision-making process. And that's also been something that's been lacking and is really important for us to do so that these decisions to have a human-centered design approach, right? You need to approach from the position that all people are people, right, and
And that's
fully
why I was building
full
on what you
participants in the
said
process.
about the national narrative, and Rev and Daniel. I think that there's synergy here to be had about, like, one of the things I will say openly is Pittsburgh is replete with theoretical frameworks. People say, that's a great idea. That's important. We're going to do the Rooney Rule. We're going to do this. But when you drill down on what is the measurable impact of that? Everybody on this call knows not a lot, not at scale. And yet we graduate 40,000 kids a year in our region. 20,000 of them leave the day after graduation. We're bleeding talent. We recruit 30,000 people a year to work. They stay for 2 years or less at a cost of $30,000 per person plus relocation costs. And yet we have 90 communities in Allegheny County. 43 are comprised of people of color. And in those 43 communities, 80,600 people. We're not investing in those people in a meaningful way that they can be attributes to the sector. We're looking at them as a problem instead of a solution. And my point is, because we're focused on the it and not the who. If we focused on the who, if we tapped into the brilliance that exists within every community, just based on their resilience, we can create a whole different way of looking at this city. But we don't. We focus on the what. We want to build this thing and not how do we optimize these people. So if there's anything that you guys can do to really shift that narrative through your vision, I would say that would be an inviting thing for the whole world to participate in particular, when you ensure that the indigenous people of the city are thriving like everybody else. Like, that has to be a narrative that we don't walk away from. You can't invite other people here and the indigenous people is barely holding on, and you think somebody that came from Chicago, DC, or LA who's a person of color wants to put their family in that situation? We're never going to turn the corner. That's why they don't stay. And it troubles me that none of these companies really do the due diligence to ask, well, why did they leave? It's not money. Those folks are getting paid handsomely to be here. There's another reason people leave. And I don't care what we build. If we don't look at that, we're going to continue to perpetuate the very thing we're fighting against. And that's why this is not a single point of contact. It's a multi-sectoral approach that we have to consider. And I will say, we talk about it, but we don't demonstrate what that looks like. And so these are just theories. They're theoretical frameworks that never move to the metaphysical level.
So to that point, I'll simply say I believe, and I think I can speak for Rev, in saying that our attempt to do this Black Pittsburgh Matters Forum, Fred, is our attempt to move towards the who and not just the what. Is our attempt to really start talking about the people and how do we better their lives, and really build up the Black community specifically, but then the city as a whole, because this city will only be as strong ultimately as this Black community is. With that being said, it is 7 o'clock, so I want to respect people's times. I do want to bring in Michael Campbell, who is the intern in Reverend Burgess's office, who has helped us put this together, actually. And if not for her, we probably wouldn't be able to produce this in the way that we are. So I want to thank her, but I want to also offer her the opportunity to present any pressing questions that may have come from the viewing public.
Thank you, Councilman Lavelle. We have a few questions. Benita has asked, how do we get assets to fund our dreams? For instance, on the north side of Pittsburgh, Manchester area, there are homes being sold for $300,000 to $400,000. I wonder how many Black people live there and can afford to live there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, one, there are probably more Black people that can afford those homes than you think. Many of them don't live inside the city. They have chosen to live somewhere else for various reasons. You know, part of that is concentrated poverty. Part of that is, you know, some of this brainwashing that took place, you know, 60 years ago, 55 years ago, when desegregation became available. We We just ran to be where we were prohibited from being, right? And so we lost that sense of people with means, right? Living somewhere where they were surrounded by people without means. You know, when I grew up, you could see some poor people, some professionals, doctors, you know, everybody in the neighborhood. And now it seems like if you can get away, you know, or out somewhere where you think is the place to be, you do. So I don't know about that particular, because again, that's to me somewhat of a short-term ask about buying that house. But one thing we do have and we need to think about in a much greater way is this idea of collective, right? So maybe we don't. Maybe the individuals on this call cannot buy a $300,000 home, but maybe there are 20 of us that can invest in a $300,000 home, right? Doesn't mean we have to live there, but we can invest and own that. And by making a return off of that, turn that around and invest and own and do other things. So because we have been prohibited from gaining a lot of individual wealth, we need to start thinking again about collectively. How can we collectively invest in business? How can we collectively invest in real estate? How can we collectively invest in education? You know, collective, because that's where the power is. Remember I said earlier, $4 billion a year comes through our households. We've got to think, you know, more strategically of how to use those dollars collectively. That only breaks down to about $50,000 per household on average, right? So it's not like a ton of money per household, but collectively we've got some power.
Thank you. I have another question that I also believe is directed towards you, Mr. Lewis. That is, for those homes being dismantled, how about rebuilding for Black ownership? What about connecting with Dollar Bank First-Time Home Owners Program? It appears that every time a Black community is rebuilt, gentrification happens and it becomes unaffordable for Black people to stay. What are some solutions to fix this issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first, again, as we talk about affordable housing or buying anything, as I mentioned very early on, Black people are overrepresented in this city, in this region for low-income jobs. So the first thing we got to look at is how do we begin to not so much focus on affordable housing, but focus on affordable wages that give us the opportunity to be able to afford different things. I was on the board and was chair of the board of Sustainable Pittsburgh several years ago before Portlock. And one report that the Sustainable Pittsburgh put out was a study done that if Black people in Pittsburgh region, it may have been a city, but I think it was a Pittsburgh region, were compensated at the same level as their white counterparts, right? And at the same employment level as their white counterparts, there would be an additional $350 million a year economic value, right? So not changing anything, right? Just employ us at the same level and employ us at the same rate. And there's an automatic $350 million impact to our community. So I would say that would generate some people that can buy some $300,000 homes anywhere they wanted to buy them.
Thank you.
If I can just add on quickly, you know, I think, and this is basically what Mark is saying, you know, a lot of times these are conversations about how to build wealth in a community, right? It's about, you know, education, it's about opportunity, right? It's about building those linkages and making sure that there's opportunities to participate equally in this society, which isn't what we currently have.
Our next question, I believe, is directed towards Mr. Brown and Dr. Portlock. Thank you. What are some, sorry, it's dropped off for a moment here. What are some affordable ways that people in Black communities can make their immediate environments more sustainable, geared towards the health effects of COVID?
Okay, that's a lot of parts to that question. Let's see. So, you know, I'd be remiss, you know, if I didn't talk about in regards to being more healthy with regards to COVID, doing all of the things that are being recommended, taking seriously social distancing and mask wearing and over nose and mouth, and doing those kinds of precautions. So those are immediate, things for the time that we're currently living in. Certainly, I think that in terms of COVID, those are probably the most important things to stress at this point. In terms of general environment space, gosh, there are a number of things that can be done in your home environment that will make, that will improve air quality, that you could talk about, and kind of basic level, plants, indoor air monitoring, to improve respiratory health and indoor air quality, reduce, eliminate smoking. There are lots of different kinds of intersections there. I think as these things connect more broadly and are more community connected, that's when you start wanting to talk about, and as Mark was pointing out, kind of the collective ability to work with others in the community to build resilience strategies and neighbors helping neighbors in times of crisis. We did touch on kind of social services taking a hit right now, but there's been really just some unbelievably amazing work happening in the direct services space in this time, and a lot of it is really depending on community members helping other community members. And I think that doesn't get enough publicity. A lot of what Fred's talking about, and I'm deviating from the question a little bit, so I apologize. But a lot of what Fred's talking about, I think, as I think through it, we talk a lot about racial justice as ways we want to, help a community, right? But without recognizing that the community is made of people who are actors and have agency and can also, there's a partnership there rather than a doing unto. And I think that difference in approach can help shape our policies in a better way too. So yeah, stay safe, get engaged.
I definitely think that that's a great question, and we need to have some practical responses. I think that in many ways we harken back to the past. I think we have to look at sharing resources. I think we have to look at bartering with one another. We have to really look at how do we optimize our gift, skills, and talents, and not just from an economic standpoint, but from a social well-being standpoint. I think we have to practice physical distancing, but also encourage social engagement through optimizing small group gatherings, using technology, but also instead of waiting for the floor to drop, we need to be more proactive thinking about what are the new emerging opportunities given what's happening with COVID. And instead, I think we've been reacting to COVID, which we have to. Somebody has to stop the bleeding. But you got to get up off the mat, right? We have to figure out what's next for us. And I think because we've been left out of so many critical conversations over the years, we don't see ourselves as problem solvers, but at the same time, we're resilient. So if we took our resilience and really showed people how to generate businesses and ideas from that, then we would create a self-sufficient community that looks at a humble beginning to great opportunity. And I think that kind of thing should be supported by multiple sectors. For example, when Mark was talking about, I'll say a generic version of the Rooney Rule, if the Allegheny Conference each company hired 5 people at the C-suite level or a senior staff level, I think that would be like 1,500 families overnight would be in a position to have better health care, live where they want to live, be in a much better mental state of mind, and be better off. And so when you think about the practical things we can do, one is we have to do a better job of being self-reliant, but that has to happen concurrently with the system creating more opportunities that is in alignment with racial equity, which we say we're interested in. There's no cleaner way to do that than saying, if we're all saying one of the biggest challenges to address creating equity is employment, sustainable, livable wage jobs. Let's deal with that straight away. And then people can choose where they want to live, where they want to invest. And I think through Mark's notion of you create that new wealth with somebody with some financial management classes, they begin to see how they have to reinvest in the community and other people, which we don't do. Mark alluded to this very acutely. When we start making money, we left. We never turned back. And as a result of that, we've abandoned a lot of people who needed us to help them get a hand up and not a handout. And what we've done is we've created a transactional relationship with our own people in many ways when we've made it to the next level. We give, but we don't support the nurturing that's necessary for that person to extract themselves from their condition. And then we blame them for not pulling themselves up from their own bootstraps. And it's just not that simple of an equation. It does require us being a village. And I think
I'm going to put out there again, too, that sustainable wages and employment, you're right, absolutely critical and intrinsically tied as well to education, right? I think that very much needs to be part of the conversation about how to fix all of the things, right? We've got so many different systems that depend on that. And when you start talking about how do you get hired in the C-suite, right? You have to have a population that's in a position for that to happen, right? And so we're doing a lot of thinking as well. And I know a lot of folks are, and a lot of our partners are, and a lot of organizations are about, connecting the chains all the way from education up through, corporate diversity, equity, inclusion, right? How do we make opportunity possible for?
And it's a concurrent thing. There's a academic arc. There's some people that don't need to go to college. That's not their calling, right? If we know that by 2050, 70% of the world's population is going to live in the urban corridors projected to, we know we got to build more housing. And we know we need to do it sustainably. Why aren't we targeting?
2050 is a big year for climate impacts.
Right. And that's why this whole arc and trajectory needs to be about sustainable development that reduces our carbon footprint so we can arrive at 2030, 40, and 50 in a better state, right? That to me is a very tangible way to educate people, inform them, and employ them in ways that we make them viable in the 21st century global economy. And instead, we're pulling back and just saying, let's just do traditional development like we've been doing, instead of saying, no, we got to plan for the future. Every project needs to have a net zero framework, right? As a minimum standard.
The dots need connecting, right? We've got, the climate conversation is not separate from the employment conversation. Those are incredibly intertwined, and they're not separate from the education conversation. Those are incredibly intertwined, and it's not separate from housing, and it's not separate from health, right? And that's where we get back to this complexity, but getting real comfortable with that so that we can actually reach the solutions that we are going to need. But I feel like we've super digressed from the person's question, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to be quiet and let Mike ask us some more things.
No, that's quite okay, because I know the comments are coming in and they appreciate all of what you all said. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for this evening's show, so I'm gonna make a request that you all hopefully will come back with us for another opportunity, because I personally had about 10 questions I simply did not get to because I was enjoying and listening to you all talk and share the information that you had. With that being said, I do want to thank you all for participating with us, and I want to specifically thank Mr. Fred Brown, the President and CEO of the Forbes Fund, Dr. Joylette Portlock, Executive Director of Sustainable Pittsburgh, and of course, Mr. Mark Lewis, President and CEO of the Poise Foundation. It's obviously very clear that in order to really restore Black communities, that we must be committed to rebuilding those communities with Black people specifically in mind, and rebuilding the actual individual person, so that we can rebuild those communities, and doing so with our partners and our allies.
I want to thank all of you for watching and participating in this town hall meeting. Remember, you can watch this town hall show on Facebook, the city's YouTube channel, or the city's cable channel. A new meeting will occur every Wednesday. I'm grateful for this conversation, for all these great leaders who've been part as we start to move our city forward together. By working together, we can make Pittsburgh really different and I think important in the lives of Black people. By working together, united in purpose, we can transform our city, strengthen it for all of its residents. Pittsburgh can only be a city for all when it becomes a city where Black Pittsburgh matters. Good evening, everybody. Stay safe and be blessed.